It's really annoying when you've worked out actually it was a really good note and you should have not shouted.
When they're right and then you're like really adamant and you go, actually,
yeah. And hello everyone, I'm Armando Iannucci and I'm here to talk about the process of screenwriting with some of the screenwriting nominees in this year's bifa Awards. I'll just say a quick introduction to everyone. We've got Joe Murtagh, who is the writer of Calm with Horses. Hi. We've got Theresa Ikoko and Claire Wilson, the writers of Rocks. Hello. And Riz Ahmed, a co-writer of Mogul Mowgli. I wanted to make this as informal as possible. I once went to a BBC workshop when I was a rookie producer, and the person guiding the workshop came in and said, this has got to be very informal. I want you all to let your hair down. I want you to have fun. If you're not prepared to have fun, get out now. And that immediately made us all seize up. But I just want to get away from the whole kind of question, answer, and hopefully we can have a discussion about just the process of screenwriting, because I noticed really these are three very different forms of story, really, and one is a sort of semi-improvised, workshopped storyline working with performers over a long period in Rocks. Joe, you had to adapt someone else's short story, and Riz, you're in it as well as writing from some of your personal experiences. What have you learned from this? You're all surprisingly all first-time writers. What have you learned from this experience?
I sometimes feel with acting is that every time you get up to do it, you feel like you're learning from scratch. Yeah. And I wonder whether there's an element of that with writing as well. At least within the process itself, every time we felt like we've cracked it, you obviously haven't. You've obviously completely overlooked something, or there's another whole central plank that needs fixing, and that never really stopped for us the whole way through the process. So I guess something that's kind of a little bit challenging, but also something that's quite liberating is that realizing that there is no point at which you've kind of worked it out, and there's something kind of anarchic and iterative about the whole process. So I mean, at least that was my experience.
I think people have this idea of screenwriting or script writing. There's a methodology to it which involves just one or two people being alone for a long time, writing words down, and then that's it. Whereas in fact, my experience has been that no two projects are the same. I mean, Theresa and Claire, you had you didn't start with a script. Did you start with an idea or?
So we had an outline, so like a pretty traditional beat sheet. Mm-hmm. That we then put up on walls, on like massive sheets of paper and across walls in a community centre in Islington, and then had the girls talk through the scenes with us, talk through the characters, put post-it notes up, draw pictures, listen to music, tell stories. And we did that for a couple of workshops. And then by that point, we'd already been working together and just like kind of youth club type vibes for for 9 months. So we knew them really well. We knew, I'm from Hackney as well, so from the same communities. So when we went to write the script, we had the beat sheet that we had developed already, and then all of this colourful like extras that we just unrolled across a table and got to infuse some of the magic from those post-it notes into the story. So things that didn't necessarily make the script, but definitely I think influenced the joy, the magic, the energy. So when we gave the script then back to the girls, there was an element, I hope anyway, or we hope, of kind of knowing it, because I think unlike most actors, they got to know the world from conception. So we would even have conversations, they'd call and have questions and have, and be desperate to know what happened next. And like, we're still working it out. So they had that kind of like sense of, they knew it was what was being made, I think, in a way that maybe some actors don't.
But that central story, did you start with that central story before you cast around for who was going to be in it? The story of a girl of 15, 16 and her younger brother, just trying to keep them together with her mother gone.
Yeah, it kind of happened, I guess, fated. I was actually working on that story on a separate project.
Yeah.
And then we were working with the Rox family on something. We didn't quite know what we wanted to tell a story about girlhood in London.
Yeah.
So I had been working on a film about sisterhood for my sister, you know, like as a dedication for my sister.
Yeah.
And it just felt very much like what I was doing on this project that I'd been working on for maybe about a year before Rox. It felt like it was very much speaking to what we were creating in these youth clubs and workshops. And we were definitely forming a bit of a sisterhood. And over here, I was writing a film about sisterhood, and it just felt like, why do two things well when I could do one thing excellently?
I've got all sorts of questions to ask you about, you know, the whole process of workshop and so, which we'll get onto in a minute. But Joe, you know, you had the opposite experience of having something that already exists as a story in terms of a short story. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
You come across the short story, and what was it about it? What was the story? And did you instantly think this is a film?
It was a weird way into it, really, because so Nick, the director, I went to film school with him, and we made a couple of short films together. And he sort of already had the ball rolling on Calm with Horses before we graduated, and sort of very kindly put my name forward for the writing on it because we worked well together. So that was probably like that was the biggest factor of me entering it to begin with. And then it was like, okay, I better actually read this thing and see if I can write it. But then I read it, and luckily it was I think it was kind of the perfect film for me to write as my first film, if that sounds weird. I guess because my family is all from that. It's set in a fictional town, but a fictional town in County Mayo in Ireland, where both my parents are from, and their parents and their parents. So it's like we have, you know, my family's sort of steeped in that part of the world. So, but in terms of like, the actual adapting of doing an adaptation. I mean, I had no frame of reference really, because I'd never done an adaptation before, but I never really did a screenplay before either. So I sort of didn't know what I was doing, but I didn't know that I didn't know what I was doing.
I think that's a good thing, though. I think
it is now.
The more you're aware of what you're taking on, I think the more frightening.
Yeah, if I had been aware, I think I would have done. I'm not necessarily saying I did a good job, but I definitely would have done a worse job if I had been more aware of myself. So I think the naivety.
A lot of people were asking me when we were adapting David Copperfield, you know, weren't you scared because there were all these other films and it's Dickens and so on. I just thought, I really liked the book, and I've just got to remember that, and everything else I've got to completely ignore. I've got to ignore the fact it's Dickens and it's taught in schools, and there have been other adaptations, because otherwise I just wouldn't write anything. I'll just seize up.
That's exactly it. When I started having all these like premonitions of like before I wasn't even on treatment stage, and I could hear these like reviews, these film critic reviews talking about how I had butchered Colin Barrett's work and all this kind of stuff. And but the more I got into it, I just had to shut those voices out.
I mean, Dickens is dead. Colin is alive.
Yeah,
kind of aware of his kind of presence,
which helped, because I met Colin, and the first thing he said, he was actually quite hungover that morning, which I think helped as well. He was just very like kind of wanted to get it over with, and he said, look, just go mad, lads. The book is the book, and the film is the film, and that was just weight off my shoulders.
And Riz, what was the spark for your? Did you have like a certain kernel of an idea of what this film was going to be, what the story was, or were you finding it out as you were writing it down?
It's a bit of both, really. It's interesting hearing Theresa talk about sometimes you have an idea that lives here and an idea that lives here, and you're developing something with someone over here, and as things progress you kind of realize, and it's a weird kind of heartbreak in a way. It's like giving away your kids. You kind of start thinking like, well, maybe this is the same as this, which is the same as this. And I'd been wanting to kind of write a story about my experience and growing up in my community for a while. And actually at the time I was developing and writing a big TV series. And it was like this big kind of epic saga across generations. And it was really difficult, really, really hard to crack. And for various reasons, it kind of got put on hold. And I guess I just had that in the back of my mind. And yet I thought, well, maybe I can find a more kind of personal way into this. And for me, at least, I kind of feel like there was a big shift in writing this film from trying to kind of almost represent others or represent a culture to just presenting myself. And so I feel like there was kind of an important shift or realization that happened in me of realizing that actually, believing that you're enough, believing your experience is enough, but believing that it is relatable, not despite its specificity, but because of it. I understand it's a cliche, isn't it? But people say specific is universal. But often if you don't see that experience on screen, if you've never really seen that, then it's very hard to believe that, if it's not in the culture, that it belongs in the culture. So that was a kind of shift for me. It was a shift in confidence, and then also a realization that maybe there's a more personal way into these bigger themes I wanted to talk about.
Well, that's right. Because, I found it in the end about a relationship between a father and a son by the end. And in fact, with all the films, I kind of find they're on big stages. The school, 15-year-old, 16-year-old girls in school, it's a very, you're trying to be something to the others. But in the end, it's about the relationship she has with her brother. And Camp with Horses, again, it feels genre-wise, it feels like it's a sort of kind of like a gangland gangster movie in the background. But again, it's about this personal. I just wonder if there's something in the atmosphere at the moment where we want to tell these, everything is so mad and big at the moment that we want to tell these kind of intimate stories.
Again, for me, it was, to be honest, that focusing in on the father and son story was probably more to do with, again, my fear and naivety and the scale of it, and trying to just make the job simpler for myself. That and create. We had a rule very early on: the film was going to be completely from Arm's POV. We wouldn't at any point know more than he knew, and then we ended up, breaking that rule a little bit, sometimes with ADR, and sometimes that came in post. But for the most part, that was kind of the rule, and just kind of focusing the story down that way, making it sort of smaller, I suppose. Definitely made everything else much more manageable. It made it easier to play with those genre conventions, I found.
So, Claire, what were you looking for when you yourself and Theresa had this idea? Did you know where it was going to go, or was it more about, okay, let's work out the process of how we involve this cast of all relative newcomers, new to performing, and are we going to allow them to tell their stories as well?
Yeah, it started kind of quite simply that the producer, Faye Ward, contacted me and Theresa and said she wanted to make a film about a girl in London today, and who would that girl be? And so first of all, we were paired, and then we spent time in schools and workshops and drama clubs, and we're kind of just getting back into that world of being 14. The sort of the electric atmosphere of all those young women was just so inspiring, and it was a case of sort of finding a story within that. And then this is the story that Theresa brought to the screen, the narrative that we followed. But getting to that point, we had spent quite a lot of time with the girls and with the casting directors, which is quite, I think, a very, very unique position to be as a writer, because normally you're sort of kept aside from that and you just get a phone call going, this person's doing it, this person's doing it. And you're like, oh, okay. So this was amazing to be inspired by them as well and involve them. And as Theresa says in the workshops, it was almost like in some cases, they were being creators with us, but also you're getting notes sometimes from 15-year-olds, which is quite a funny thing.
Notes from the cast, what were they like?
Well, it was more like just involving in feedback in that sort of way. Normally you kind of had these big, scary sort of notes from executives, but actually 15-year-olds who are equally, when you're telling a story about their lives, it's kind of like on their opinions, and because they have their music and their culture and their conversations. So it was interesting.
But their notes were really just fun, though. Their notes would always just be like, oh yeah, and then that happened to my aunt, and then my neighbor, and then she had a party and it got locked off, and then it was always just, it was never really like a judgment. It was always just like, yeah, and then like particularly Afi, who plays Yawa, you would say, oh yeah, and then in this scene they fall out, and then she'd have a story about a neighbor or a cousin, and the detail, and then the McDonald's, and then how it ended, and then she would show us a Snapchat video. It was really.
Were you able to work flexibly enough to kind of incorporate elements of those into the story as you were filming? Yeah,
I think so. I think particularly around things like music and dance. So the whole theme of dance came from Afi, because she is a Beyonce in the making. So
Right.
she dances, so she wanted her character to dance, and we thought, oh, what a wonderful thing to like showcase a bit. So like there was those things where they like D'Angelo, who plays Emmanuel, loves dinosaurs, so the dinosaurs came. So just making it fun and enjoyable, and also giving them parts of the character that they could really show off in, felt like a really fun thing and a privileged thing to do.
Do you, Riz, as the performer, as the main, you know, as the lead as well, did you feel you were writing it?
You know, weirdly, I mean, I think BBC Films kind of left us alone, you know, which was amazing. I think their notes were quite kind of were great, but they weren't kind of, you know, really trying to get their hands all over it. They were like, listen, are you trying to say this? Because this is how I'm understanding this. So maybe think about if you want to make it clearer. And then we actually think about, do we want to make it clearer? Actually, there's a lot of this film we deliberately don't want to explain and clarify, particularly when you're stepping into a culture. We don't want it to have to be translated. You know, so much of the film is about how you have to translate yourself to different contexts. So we didn't want to do that. We wanted it to feel disorienting at times, and they were cool with that. But it was a kind of weird workshop-y thing. And it never ended, really. And so that line between performing and writing was usefully blurred, I think, in the same way that you guys are talking about in the Rocks process, where one is feeding into the other and that never ends. And I don't know if you guys found that fluidity on, you know, I think that's one of the amazing things about, you know, working on some of these smaller scale films is that, you know, you can chop and change, you can be a bit more nimble, and, you know, vast swathes. The whole ending of our film, we came up with right there and then, not like on the day, but like we had an ending, it totally wasn't working. You know, it was like, we have to shut down now. We have to, and we just kind of, we made it up there and then, that whole final scene. And there's a few scenes like that where we're rewriting them as we went. So one kept feeding into the other. And that was amazing. That was beautiful to be able to have that feedback between performance and writing.
Well, that's the thing. And again, just going back to this conventional notion of what writing is, it isn't a kind of solitary, static kind of process. It's sort of, it's a collaborative process, really. You're contributing to what's in the final, what's on screen, in the same way the actors are. And if they're going to give different takes and different performances, you're doing rewrites and changes and alterations on the basis of what you've already shot. We do for things like when we're doing something like The Thick of It, we do lots of workshops and improvisations and stuff like that. And sometimes a scene that we'd sweated for 4 or 5 months on with the writers, suddenly something really funny comes up in the improv, and we think, well, let's go with that. And unfortunately, the writers don't feel, hang on a minute, I've worked for 5 months on that scene, now you're ripping up. Because all the actors would say, no, if we didn't have that scene to muck about with, we would have been absolutely drowning. But because we've got that safety net, we can feel we can add to it and play about with it, and that provide. And I think it's that sense of collaboration, I think, that is really kind of improves things. But Joe, were you involved when you were on set? Were you allowed on set? Were you pitching in thoughts as you?
I wasn't allowed. No, I was allowed, but I wasn't on set because they started shooting the day I was getting married over here in Spain.
Okay.
So I had a good excuse not to. I was there for the read-through a few days before that, and to be honest, that's kind of as far as I wanted to be. I love the development process, but I just love like kind of handing over the script. And
do you? Oh, that's interesting. So, what did you feel when you first saw a cut then?
I was just really excited. I was just every single night just waiting on my computer for rushes to come through, for the cuts to come through, and I like being outside of that a little bit compared to, say, the producer, director, or the EPs. I just really enjoy watching the thing get made. I feel like almost like an audience member in that sense.
I suppose you have to be working then with someone that you have a lot of trust in terms of.
That definitely helped. Being
true to the
film school with Nick and having the director there alongside you from the very beginning when it's just the origin of the idea. We have the book, but then the treatment, screenplays, having the director there alongside you, it means there's not going to be any, or at least there's going to be fewer nasty surprises. Yeah.
I wonder if it's still a very British thing that writers are still traditionally seen as the ones that hand the script over and then go away, and the director takes over. Whereas in America, you know, the writers become the showrunners. The writers become the ones who are, you know, valued. I'm not saying they're not valued in the UK, but it struck me when I was starting out how it was very much a director-driven kind of industry, as opposed to a writer-driven one.
It's the difference between TV and film, isn't it? I think because in film it is still quite director-led, and I mean I think it was unusual, our experience, to be on set all the time and you know, being part of it and then being in the edit the whole time. But I know in TV it's moving towards the American system now, where it's like it needs to be there to sort of cover the consistency and to be rewriting on set. And
because you've done with HBO, and so I mean, have you noticed that difference between, you know, the value of the writer in the US?
I think Claire's right about TV versus film. You know, when you kind of need to produce hours and hours of screen time, then suddenly the writer has a different kind of level of importance, and they're really the through line. Often you're not going to get the same director throughout every episode, so the consistent element throughout it all is that writer. The writing process that we're describing right now is kind of a collaborative, open-ended, living, breathing one, but that's not everyone's process. And it's quite interesting actually to see, as some of those writers become kind of showrunners, that there is an adaptation that needs to happen on some of those writers' parts as well. Because the one thing is, as a writer, you're sat down, you're the master of your universe. If you can imagine it, you put it on the page, that's how it is. When you're on set directing, it's compromise from day one. Every day, every hour is a different compromise. It becomes a living, breathing thing that you have to kind of let go of control of. I wonder whether there is, though, something in what you're saying about the British approach being more based in theatre.
Yes.
You know, and like Shakespeare, particularly as an actor, I think I've always found that British approach is about the primacy of the text. You're handed over the text like it's the Bible, and it's your job to make sense of it.
I think you're right. Whenever I suggested to them in the early days of doing stuff, think of it, so do you want to just play about with it? There'd be a kind of, with some, there'd be a kind of, but it says, I mean, it's a funny line. I don't want to spoil that, you know. I'll put a pause there, but I won't change the words. You know, and it might be that we have this theatre tradition, whereas in America, it's more ready to go straight into movies.
I do think that we have both traditions, though, and I think that's what's interesting about British film and British independent film. You know, is you've got this tradition of, like, you know, if you look at what these guys did with Rocks, and you look at like Ken Loach
with Rocks, were you able to? Were people expecting, the people who were funding the film, were they expecting to see a script or a draft, or were they buying into the notion that they weren't really going to see the story until it had been worked out and shot?
No, we definitely had a script. It was definitely, I think it was a lot more formal, the writing process, than I think people imagine. So we had, I think at the beginning where we got to do the workshops, that was really fun. And then, to be honest, writing it, I still thought was fun. But we definitely wrote a script, had to do drafts, got notes. It was definitely like late nights being like, okay, let's switch at midnight. But what I loved about Rocks was, like, you know, we sometimes were like half a page of stage directions, and it would, and I think it, like, I went back and read the script the other day, and it really does, I think, read like a really lovely, like novella in some parts, because we did get to just really just express, and there was a real reverence, I think, for the world that we created.
I mean, that's interesting. That's genuinely surprised me, because it, you know, and it's down to how well you've shot it, because it feels so spontaneous. There's
a lot of credit to the casting directors who had been working with the girls with camera work, with Anu, the associate director. So set was just as chaotic as the youth clubs. So sometimes they wouldn't call action, and what the girls thought was rehearsal, and just chatting was being shot. And the girls knew the world really well, and we done a lot of rehearsal, and they knew the script, and they were really committed to what we had created as a collective, that if they went off and try something different, it was okay. And Maya as well, our editor, she went through hours, like I think it was like 200 hours altogether, including the social media footage, to really find story in places where it was just kind of just a bit chaos.
Were you shooting like hours and hours of stuff then?
Yeah. I don't know the ratio, but it was like 3 times the amount of hours you normally shoot on a film or something like that.
Yeah.
And how much of the eventual story was found in the edit then?
We had a good idea, I think, because also we shot in sequence, so we got to do a lot of what you and Riz described, where we were on set every day, and after every take, we would give notes. So it was constantly alive. So sometimes we'd have, there were moments I was really committed to the scene that we had written as we had written it, and for whatever reason it just wasn't working, and having to make that compromise and understand that just because you've written it, just because it works on paper doesn't mean it works. So then Claire and I would have to stay behind or want to stay behind and want to rewrite tomorrow's scene based on what happened today. And I think shooting in chronological order really helped us.
Oh, absolutely. I try as much as possible to shoot. I mean, it's not always possible just because of availability of cast and locations. But what I try and do is get as many people together in advance, and we just hire a church hall and we workshop each scene, we workshop it in story order with the cast for like 2 weeks, just so that we can, a lot of the choreography we can work out then.
Where were you with this advice 2 years ago?
Well, I was on set. It goes back to what we were saying, it's better to be naive about what's required and just go for it, because I didn't realize that normally doesn't happen, the rehearsal process. I just assumed that's what you did. I mean, what was when you said you were at the table read for Camp with Horses, was it ready to go, or did you feel there was work still to be done?
No, it was pretty much ready to go then. I'm always fascinated by the rehearsal process though, because I'd always be scared that by doing rehearsal or too much rehearsal beforehand, you might actually lose the thing. That then you'll do it in rehearsal and it won't turn up on set. Right. That would be my fear. But I don't know if there's any truth in that.
I don't know. The longer I've gone on, the more I've realised there is no right way and no wrong way of. Everyone is different, and every actor is different as well. How did you find it, Riz, in terms of obviously being at the heart of it? What was the prep like?
We were kind of really trying to find out what this story was. We had a lot of ideas, a lot of themes, a lot of experiences, a lot of scenes. We were kind of trying to map out the story because, in truth, one of our real goals with this film that we were constantly trying to do was trying to push the envelope a little bit in terms of the language of the film. To not shackle ourselves to a kind of social realism. We're really interested in this idea of like drawing on South Asian and Muslim art and mythology and spirituality and that heritage, and allowing that to inform the storytelling. You have like video artists like Arthur Jaffa or, people like Khalil Joseph. They talk often about Black visual intonation and about how the forebears for Black cinema should be kind of jazz musicians rather than Hollywood. And we were kind of really enamored with that idea and thought about what's a kind of visual grammar for, contemporary Muslim diasporic cinema. And so we kind of were trying to explore this language of like magical realism.
So where were you working this? Were you working this out on set, or was this?
Before we went to shoot, one thing we did is we went to Bassam and I met in New York. We became friends there. And we went to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. We went to their Islamic art collection. And we spent like 2 days just looking at everything there and looking at how Mughal miniatures are framed always, where they try and get rid of depth and they kind of flatten everything in 2D, or how you kind of obscure people's faces within our tradition. And so we were doing a lot of that in prep. And then it kept coming up again and again as we were writing it. And then a lot of it as well was in the edit. It was actually in the kind of the rhythm of the cut, and also like what you show and what you reveal and what you hide. We just wanted to try something different.
Yeah, well, it was good to have that kind of freedom and flexibility. How did you on Rocks? How did you marshal? When you were in the throes then of the filming and going into the edit, did you have a clear idea of how it was going to end?
Well, the story is exactly how we kind of pictured it. The peak to the story. We had to do a pickup on something that didn't quite come across, and it sort of, the dramatic turn wasn't quite there. It wasn't hitting what we needed. But I suppose the biggest change was the ending, which we had shot two sort of different endings, and the one today is the one that we went with, which is a really powerful. It's not much different, but it was just that slight sort of nip that made it made it sort of more powerful. So that was something unexpected, I think, for us.
Yeah.
And that actually came from Maya Mafioli, the editor. And so I guess for me, with this being like my first experience of film, like I'm now so baffled at the idea that films have been given to one person for so long, because I've seen how little it does belong to any one person. Really, like Maya, she had the script and she had such a commitment, because all she got rushes every day and she had the script, but that's all she had. She wasn't with us for the 9 months or the year and a half beforehand. But to see her have such a passion and such a commitment to the story, to the point where sometimes we were in the edit as well, Claire and I, and sometimes I'd just be like, oh, let's just go home, it's not working. And she would turn around and say, no, give me until Sunday.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get it. And so, you know, that ending came from Maya having such an understanding of what we was trying to say with the ending that we had written down, that she felt could be said better than the ending that was shot. And somehow finding she just married what she saw on screen with what she saw on paper. And I think in some ways was able to say, I think I see it better. So we had to get Emmanuel CGI'd out of the last scenes because he was in them. And it was her that felt like, actually, no, because the original ending that we wrote, Rox leaves him at the very end of the film.
Right.
But Maya understood that the film was saying something different about where Rox's journey should take her to. So he was CGI'd out of.
That's funny when someone else comes up with something that surprises you, and actually you think, but it was there all the time. I just didn't quite see it. You know, I'm so close up to other details that you're obsessing over that you miss the bigger thing, that someone who steps in from outside.
Yeah. That's a big part of who you collaborate with and making the same film. Like I say this all the time, but being on a project where you realize halfway through you're trying to make something different from each other is quite a sort of, you know, it's a real shock, and that happens quite a lot in the creative process where people. Well,
it can be quite frightening, but also, you know, you suddenly realize that these things that you feel are very personal and you put a lot of energy in, actually they have a life of their own, and it's sometimes better to see where it wants to go, you know. And it's useful if someone comes in whose judgment you trust and everything, but who's seeing it from, you know, maybe not so kind of emotionally up close, and is able to go, no, take that away, and there you go. The whole thing's different now. I remember the very first film I did, you know, it took us about 7 weeks to shoot, but it took about 6 months to edit. And I boiled it down to about 2 hours, but I knew I had to lose 10 minutes. It just didn't feel like a 2-hour film. And there were these two scenes that were my two favorite scenes, but they kept disrupting everywhere I put them. And I must have spent about 2 months trying to make these two scenes work, putting them out. And in the end, the editor just took them out. And I watched the film back, and there was the film. And that was such a kind of eye-opener about how, you know, you can get really attached. I think you're attached to the memory of making it and where you saw it originally in the story, but actually the finished thing is a different thing altogether, isn't it?
And the other weird thing about that is then when you go back and read the script with those being still in it, it still works. I mean, in some cases, I'm assuming you go back and you're like, yeah, it doesn't work. But with Calm with Horses, for example, there was a couple of things at the ending that we had, like that thinking about now would be nuts if we had included them in the actual film. It was too, like, there was a whole massive fight scene at the end, and there was all this stuff. And, like, I went back and reread the script, and I was like, it works on the page, but it doesn't work on the film. It's a kind of weird phenomenon. So
the script, presumably you go into the film confident that the script has given you that kind of launching pad, and then you discover things in the process that means you slightly alter.
Can I ask Armando, when you start, do you always understand the process might be different every time, but do you always start in the same way? Do you write a prose kind of outline or treatment where you know where you're going, or do you just write scenes without having the big picture of knowing?
No, I mean, and I'm very lucky to have a whole team of writers that, you know, over the years I've written with in little different combinations. And it would start with just going for a very long walk when we were allowed to, and just talking about characters and where could this go? Where's it going to end up? And then doing a kind of a beat sheet, you know, working out the story, really, doing a beat sheet. And then every new draft is really just adding a bit more to that. It's like putting a bit more flesh on, a bit more flesh on, a bit more. But I kind of like to cast early so that I know who we're writing for, who those voices are, which I suppose would be something in Rocks you would, given that you worked with them from a early stage, you could start hearing them in your head when you were writing. You knew the personalities. So it's about that, but very often, if it's a TV show, usually I don't know what the final episode is going to be, and we don't work it out until nearer the time. So that gets quite nerve-wracking. For a film, completely different. But having said that, there's usually a little bit towards the end of the film that I have a vague idea of emotionally what it should be or visually what it should be, but I don't quite know yet what's actually going to happen in it. But I just wish all filmmaking was a bit like that. You had that freedom to play around at the beginning and have that fluid process, that workshopping at the beginning, and that freedom in the edit as well to play. I haven't got onto the subject of notes from executives. Have you ever had trouble with notes? Do you have psychologically, can you accept notes, or do you fight against them, or anyone?
I think the first reaction is just to sort of throw your toys out the pram and then like take a breath.
How dare they?
And then read them again and go, yeah, that was actually a really good point. Or,
I know. It's really annoying when you've worked out actually it was a really good note and you should have not shouted.
When they're right, and then you're like really adamant. And you go, actually,
yeah.
Really,
Although I remember my first notes were from a there was a comedy script, it was in the loop, and it was from a non-comedy person. Against all the jokes was the note, do we need this? And I sort of thought, well, no, we don't really. You know, a joke is a joke. You know, if I take all the jokes out, it's a really dull film. So I managed to avoid those. But usually, if they can buy into your process, then usually their notes are going to be in line with what it is you're trying to achieve, really.
I think it speaks to what Claire said earlier about who you're working with. Like, I really actually enjoy notes because I feel like it's a time for where I don't have to do it all by myself. I like saying, what do you think?
Yes.
Well, what are your thoughts? And I also really like enjoy saying no. Like,
yeah.
That's stupid. That's a stupid idea. And then also being told no as well. So I'm quite fortunate that I'm working, like, I try and make it a habit to only work with people that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
It's like, would I go for a drink with them? And then notes sessions tend to be quite fun. And it's also really nice when you feel like you're working with people who have been with you from the beginning of an idea, and they get excited, or you get excited, or they help crack something, or you crack something. And particularly when people know your style. So I like to be inspired in note sessions. So I like to be asked questions rather than be told solutions. And that's always really fun.
It's a kind of organic process that not giving. I said right at the start that you're all first time screenwriters, but it feels like I don't quite believe you're all pretty seasoned, really. But there is a, you know, if you had advice for people starting out, wanting, you know, absolutely their ideal is to get involved not just in writing but in screenwriting, any sort of tips, advice, do's, don'ts, things to avoid?
One thing I always find, because it's something I went through, I'm sure it's something everyone went through, but especially with young writers, there's always this fear of like, I've got to get an agent, I've got to get producers, I've got to get people to read my work. But really it's like, well, do you actually have work to read? Do you have good work to read? It sounds like such a simple, obvious thing, but I think that fear of finding an agent and getting work, because it's such a fickle, mysterious world to enter, it can feel like a big daunting thing, which I suppose it is to a degree, but it's like, I think screenwriting, you know, very relatively speaking, I think screenwriting might be the easiest out of the whole film thing to get into, because you can just create your own work. You know, you don't need anyone's permission to go and do your work. You can go and theoretically go and create the most awesome portfolio the world has ever seen, and then worry about getting it out there. But Steve Martin always said, get so good they can't ignore you. That would be my sort of advice to young screenwriters in particular. Just get really good at writing, and then I think the work will come. That might be a big old statement to say, but I feel like at the moment, especially in the British film industry, I feel like there's just such a desire for material. I think there's people who just want to read stuff. So write something good, and I think the work will come.
That chimes with something I remember Paul Merton telling someone, is like, keep writing. That's his advice, just keep writing. In that the more you write, the better you'll become. Because every time you write something, you learn something new. From your experience on Rocks, that's a kind of different, that's a different sort of, not that radically different, but it's, the process is so reliant on the process, isn't it? In doing that, is there something there that you would pass on to others in terms of things that you learned from taking on such a, because it was quite a lengthy process from early workshops to finished on, wasn't it?
It was what, 2 years maybe? It's not that long compared to how, you can have a script that you've been trying to get optioned for years.
Maybe not necessarily like what I learned from Rocks, but just like it's been sort of my MO in general, just like write joyfully, write what you love. I think there's a whole thing now where everyone's trying to write the next type of script, or then, but you can tell if you don't love it, and you can tell if you don't care, and you'd be surprised at the thing that you love that you can make other people love. Like, Rocks was really a story about a black girl wandering around Hackney for a week and a half, and it probably wasn't gimmicky or like or sexy enough in a pitch, but if you write what you love, people will love it too. And I think that's sometimes underrated in this world.
I think that's important. That's the thing I've felt is like you always, again, I can only speak from the comedy perspective, but write what makes you laugh rather than what you think will make the commissioning editor of Channel 4 laugh, or because you'll never write your best stuff. So that chimes with that in terms of write from your heart, really, write from what it is that excites and inspires you. Do you see yourself as a writer, Riz? Did you imagine, as you were making it, I'm always surprised when people call me a writer because I feel I just make stuff.
I mean, I think so. I think, I think just always just trying to work it all out, right? Yeah. Just kind of learning as you go. And it's like a constant process of getting beaten up by it and getting schooled by this process. But hopefully, in a way, I kind of try and lean into that more and just try and think, well, what's the thing that scares me because I'm out of my comfort zone? And I think if you keep, it's like what you were saying, what Paul Merton said, keep writing. It's a way of saying keep growing, Yeah. So I think if you go where the growth is, that's often scary, and, you shouldn't be feeling like, oh yeah, I've got this down, but, you're learning and you're stretching yourself.
Well, that's a good message to end on, really. Keep going. Thanks very much for that. We could have gassed on for the rest of the day. Good luck on February the 18th at 8 p.m. is the awards. They're on the Bifa Facebook, Bifa YouTube channels. But congratulations on wonderful scripts, wonderful films. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Armando.
And bye-bye.
Much love. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.